So now, without further ado, please allow me to introduce our opening plenary speakers, Dr. Juan Carlos Arian and Mr. Deshaun Jones. Dr. Juan Carlos Arian is an internationally recognized activist, public speaker, trainer, facilitator, and published author. He works as program director with Futures Without Violence. Since 1991, he has walked along with men across different cultures in a collective healing journey to become better fathers, intimate partners, and allies to end gendered violence and achieve gender equity. He was previously the director of the National Latin Network at Casa de Esperanza and the first sexual assault prevention specialist at Harvard University. Dr. Arian is an active trainer who has led hundreds of workshops and presentations throughout the United States, the Americas, and the Caribbean, as well as Europe, Asia, the US Congress, and the United Nations in New York and Geneva. Mr. Deshaun Jones is a native Washingtonian. We don't meet many of those, but he is one. He's a graduate of Anacostia High School with a BA from the University of the District of Columbia. Mr. Jones currently works as a parent engagement education resource specialist or peer specialist with the DC Child and Family Service Kinship Unit. This unit works vigilantly with biological parents to help them navigate the family court system to successfully reunify with their children. Deshaun has worked for over 20 years in human services for the Department of Recreations in Aquatics, Potomac Job Corps as a recreational specialist, Seed Public Charter School as a residential advisor, and Capitol Hill Group Ministry as a case manager dedicated to the safety and well-being of children and families in the District of Columbia. Since 2017, he volunteered as a member of PAVE, Parents Amplifying Voice in Education, as a parent leader in education in DC Ward 7 to help parents have a voice to improve our education system standards and policies. Deshaun is a proud and committed father of 4 children, a brother of Omega Psi Phi fraternity, oh, my brother, and an avid swimmer. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Juan Carlos Arian and Mr. Deshaun Jones.
Morning. Yeah, I'm not going to forget my glasses. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. And yes, native Washingtonian. Like I said, my name is Deshaun Jones. I was born and raised in Ward 8, Southeast DC. My parents were not married, and my father was present in the home until his death in 1980. I've always had a close relationship with my mother. However, we had some tense moments while I was growing up because she was very overprotective. I graduated from Anacostia in 1991, and in 2009, received my bachelor's degree in sociology and anthropology from the University of the District of Columbia. I currently reside in Ward 7 and work for DC's Child and Family Service Agency as a peer specialist dedicated to the safety, permanence, and well-being of children and families in the district. I work to perpetuate perseverance through patience and practice. My past and present community activism. At CFSA, I'm a part of the Children's Justice Act, the Court Improvement Project, and Thriving Families, Safer Children, where we're working to make a transition from the child welfare system to a child well-being system. I've participated in DC Education Research Collaborative, where research practice partnerships in assisting and gathering community information to provide actionable independent research to support improvement in DC public and charter schools, serving as a parent representative appointed by the mayor's office. I've worked on a panel for a new profit called the PAC, which is the Parent Advisory Council, where we work for Equitable Education Recovery Act and reviewed applications of social entrepreneurs seeking grant funds to help them execute their plan for social and educational improvement. I've been a panelist for Ed Forward, the strongest year yet. And that was to help foster better accountability and actualizing proper outcomes. I was a panelist for the Zoom Foundation in Connecticut, focused on parent engagement to improve education. I'm a member of the DC Parent and Community Advisory Board, Office of the Community and Engagement. I've participated in the Center for American Progress, CAP, as a focus group member to explore options on K-12 accountability systems. And yes, PAVE, Parents Amplifying Voices in Education, as a ward and citywide member. And our mission has been to connect, inform, and empower parents and give families in DC a voice and a choice in the vision of education for our city by meeting with the mayor, deputy mayor of education, the chancellor, and testifying in front of various councils in DC. Why do I tell you all of this? It's because that's who I am. And what I did was commit intimate partner violence. In 2010, my children's mother and I had a domestic dispute that resulted in a CPO. A civil protection order was put in place restricting my access to my home and my family. I lived with my mother for about a year before I moved into my own place. The stress I endured from my actions resulted from multiple court cases, custody, child support, and trying to manage finances to maintain my home, as well as follow court orders. I went on for almost 2 years before my wife and I were able to come to an understanding that we wanted to bring our families together. Late November 2012, we came to an agreement and reconciled our relationship by bringing our family together. However, there was still a few unresolved issues from our past that we had not dealt with effectively. My infidelity, my volatility. Our marriage suffered. We used her EPA, participated in couples counseling, and saw a therapist for a few sessions. And during those sessions, I had to address my infidelity and volatility towards my wife. That became very challenging for me because I wanted to get past the infidelity. And I wasn't willing to accept full responsibility for all that had been done, and regularly requested for my concerns to be addressed. We had very different parenting styles to get the children to respond. I didn't always like being the disciplinarian, but she never accepted the responsibility for applying consequences, and many of my consequences were punitive due to my culminating frustration. She always wanted to have conversations about my infidelity. I would become angry during those conversations, trying to answer her questions and figure out ways to prove my family was all I wanted. I was overwhelmed with frustration and became volatile, raised my voice, use profanity, making threats, and sometimes following through with those threats by getting physical. I was remorseful for the abusive behavior, but I did not take sole responsibility and identified my wife as a perpetrator of domestic violence. Do I believe my wife provoked me? At times. I would say yes. And I would allow the things that she did to upset me. She knew what I didn't like, and it didn't sit well with me. But I allowed myself to become consumed with emotion and limited restraint. I believe the abusive incidents affected the children, and I had a desire to stop the behavior. I remained in the relationship to be an active part of my children's life. We had some good times and more times that looked more promising. However, she was still haunted by the past trauma I caused her. In May of 2013, my children were removed, and I thought that would cost me my relationship with my children. I was substantiated for abuse and neglect and charged with an assault on a minor. My wife was always, excuse me. My wife was away for 2 weeks in the Philippines, caring for her sick grandfather. Before she left, her and I had a serious argument. I was unable to compartmentalize my anger and my frustration. And when my oldest child repeatedly disobeyed my instructions to leave her sister alone and get ready to go, I gave her a whooping. During the court proceedings, my wife left and took the kids with her to stay in a family shelter for abused women and children. That was my greatest loss. And I experienced some level of depression and tremendous feelings of loss, sadness, guilt, pessimism, and self-deprecation. I felt that my life was a failure. I wasn't experiencing any joy from activities that I previously participated in. I believed I was being punished for what was extremely self-critical. I spent a lot of time crying, having difficulties making decisions, and plenty of sleepless nights. I was court ordered to have psychological and psychiatric evaluation and follow recommendations, drug testing, parenting classes, a domestic violence assessment, and supervised visitation. After completing those services, I was granted protective supervision in January of 2014. My children were actively engaged in therapy. I have completed effective Black parenting and utilized as much of the information as I could to help bring a sense of normalcy to my home, managing this new situation. During my divorce, shared custody with their mother, I completed the PAC program, which is the program for agreement and cooperation. There were 5 focus areas: understanding the harm and conflict it causes children, understand the importance of insulating children from conflict, help the parties develop conflict-free ways to communicate, help the children cope with the emotional stress and practical consequences of a separated family, and foster healthy co-parenting relationships. My children seem to have been managing well in the new situation, but I knew there was a lot of work that needed to be done. I had to gain a lot of understanding from a number of resources that were published, like the US Department of Health and Human Services, talking about long-term effects on domestic violence and abuse. More than 15 million children in the United States live in homes in which domestic violence has happened at least once. These children are at greater risk for repeating the cycle as adults by entering abusive relationships and becoming abusers themselves. For example, a boy who sees his mother being abused is 10 times more likely to abuse his female partner as an adult. A girl who grows up in a home where her father abuses her mother is more than 6 times as likely to be sexually abused as a girl who grows up in a non-abusive home. Children who witness or are victims of emotional, physical, or sexual abuse are at higher risk of health problems as adults. These can include mental health conditions such as depression and anxiety. This may also include diabetes, obesity, heart disease, poor self-esteem, and other problems. In 2014, as a first grader attending Eagle Academy Public Charter School, my son DJ was experiencing challenges dealing with the divorce of his mother and me. He was acting out in school. I requested the student support team meeting, and a behavioral intervention plan was put in place. I also requested to see the school clinician. He continued with those services until he graduated. With the support of the school's mental health team, he went on to graduate 3rd grade as one of 4 students to receive the highest scores in his graduating class, and the only male. My oldest daughter, Kayla, was a freshman at Columbia Heights Education Campus. I wanted to help make sure her adjustment was as smooth as possible. After asking if there were therapeutic services, I was informed that the Mary Center was on site inside the school building. I was pleased to know an outside agency was working in the school to accommodate students. I signed her up immediately with the idea that specialized assistance would help her adjust to high school. I am a firm believer in therapy because it allows a safe space to share your thoughts and feelings and help work them out. Excuse me. You have to be aware of different types of childhood trauma. ACEs, as we call them, adverse childhood experiences, and their prevalence. How childhood trauma affects across a lifetime by Dr. Nadine Burke Harris references the study by Dr. Felici and Dr. Anda at the CDC, and together they asked 17,000 adults about their history of exposure to what they called adverse childhood experiences. That included physical, emotional, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, mental illness, and substance dependency, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, and domestic violence. They noticed two things. One, ACEs are incredibly common. 67% of the population had at least one ACE. 12.6%, 1 in 8, had 4 or more ACEs. The second thing that they found was that there was a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes. The higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcome. The original ACEs study was done in Southern California in 1995 and 1997 in a population that was 70% Caucasian and 70% were college educated. As a DC native, a Black man growing up in this city, just imagine if they did that study today with a population of 70% African American and 70% high school graduate or GED recipients. We need to realize the impact of trauma on children's brain and the influence of the child's brain development on learning and social emotional growth. We need to recognize learning challenges and behaviors that are a result of trauma and develop plans to address them in a trauma-sensitive way using the best practices possible. Also, understand how trauma-informed care fits into the continuum of learning and develop strategies to avoid re-traumatization. There is a huge need for health professionals to help the community, families, and educational institutions increase the awareness of emotional intelligence. Our top 3 agents of socialization is family, schools, and your peers. Those who have high level of emotional intelligence can understand the physical, mental, and social impact that negative emotions have on their bodies, minds, and relationships, and the ability to pursue and achieve goals. They then can moderate their own emotions so that their emotions support their activities and enhance their quality of life. As a public servant, I have a responsibility to hold myself to a higher standard because of the work I do, the sensitivity of the training I have, which reflects the class and professionalism that I must exhibit as a DC government employee and CFSA peer specialist. I am a father and an active parent who have navigated the family court system, and since January of 2014 have been successfully reunified with my children, which is an important factor in doing my job. My presence and responsibility as an advocate for change is a direct reflection of the work I do and how to engage families, assist with finding resources, and generating ideas on how to manage not only themselves, but their current situation. It requires a partnership where I share my knowledge and experience for them to see that there can be success. I look back to reflect and adjust so that I can move forward and enlighten the family and enlighten the families that I work with in hopes that they are able to use the information for future progress. Children can recover from experiences, intimate partner violence and abuse. Children respond differently. Some are more resilient and some are more sensitive. The success of children recovering from abuse or trauma is predicated on multiple factors. A good support system or good relationships with trusted adults, helping to create a space for high self-esteem and healthy relationships. Although children will probably never forget what they saw or experienced during the abuse, they can learn healthy ways to deal with their emotions and memories as they mature. The sooner a child gets help, the better his or her concern, the better his or her chances of becoming a mentally and physically healthy adult. Today, thanks for being patient. Today, I have almost a decade of being reunified and a proud and committed father of 4 children. Kayla is now a freshman at North Carolina A&T University studying pre-law. And we just recently found out that she was accepted into Howard's summer intern law program. My son, DJ, is a sophomore student athlete at Eastern Senior High School. We have our challenges, but we're still working and we haven't given up on each other. Kaya is a freshman at Columbia Heights Education Campus, and she's doing very, very well. And Demira, my youngest, she's a first grader at Kip Aspire. Demira has a different mom, but I made sure that I got all of them on the same schedule, alternating from week to week. And their moms, we've been working pretty well together. All of the additional support that they received, that I received, helped to aid in our progress. Thank you.
Well, that was amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much. What a incredible way to start a conference about breaking the cycle of intergenerational trauma, about healing. It's actually quite hard for me to follow your story, although it helps so much to frame the conversation about why it is important to work with men and fathers in our communities, I often start presentations by asking the audience, why is it important to do this? But I think after listening to Sean's amazing story, I hope we all would recognize not only his personal work, but the work that he's doing in the community and with your own children, Sean. So thank you for your work. I see that the PowerPoint it was not updated, but that's okay. This is the one from the webinar that we did, but it's very similar. Maybe it was my mistake that I said it. So anyway, good morning, everybody. My name is Juan Carlos Arean. Work with Futures Without Violence, which is a national and international nonprofit that does what the name says, trying to create futures without violence. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak here today. And actually, before I go into the actual presentation, I would like to have a conversation with Sean. We had thought that this would make a good transition because we can ground the conversation in the lived experience that he just shared with us. And Sean is also open before the presentation to answer some of your questions in person and online. So if you have a question, there will be an opportunity to share that. So I'm going to switch to this mic here so that we can have this conversation, Sean, and I'm going to sit down in a second. So, and sorry if this is in the middle for some folks. So in listening to your story, what I hear is a progress from a place probably of woundedness, denial, to a place of awareness, to a place of self-examination that clearly wasn't easy and nor fast, and it's probably ongoing, to a place of healing, especially with your children. So can you tell us a little more about what were the elements that made you realize this is not working, what I'm doing? I need to start changing. Do you remember, maybe there was more than one thing that happened, but do you remember what it was?
There was a destructive nature that a number of other people identified around me that I wasn't willing to accept. And my life as I knew it was mentally, emotionally, and literally a fight. So those elements of self-awareness, having some humility, bravery, and courage to accept the outside voices played a major factor. And losing my children because of actions, my own personal actions, was very devastating.
Thank you for that. For me, I get to do a lot of presentations, but I very rarely present with someone that can inspire the way that you are inspiring us. And for me, one of the most important things is humanizing people who cause harm. Because I think sometimes, for reasons that are totally understandable, we tend to dehumanize or to demonize people who cause harm. But by and large, people who cause harm are people like Deshaun, people like me. They're just people who probably have had a lot of problems in their lives. And there is the possibility of healing. It's not universal. There's some people that don't choose to do that. Sometimes I'm asked, can men who use violence, intimate violence, change? And I say, yes, 100% of them can change if they choose to change, because that journey of changing is not easy. So could you share a little, you mentioned a little about your healing journey and going to therapy. What were the things that were the most important for you in terms of your healing journey?
Accountability, acceptance of the information that I was receiving from other people that saw me in a way that I didn't see myself. That work in accepting that information and being accountable and knowing and understanding that my actions were a direct response of my lack of restraint and my lack of self-control helped motivate me to making the change.
Thank you. So I'll probe a little bit more there. When you say accountability, and I heard in your presentation, you said taking full responsibility 3 times, I think you mentioned it. So when you talk about accountability, how did that look like? Because sometimes in our society, we equate accountability with punishment, right? Even we used, when someone goes to jail, so, well, he was held accountable. So for me, that's not accountability, that someone goes to jail unless they take full responsibility, right? So that's a different story. So do you remember what helped? Maybe someone told you something or you realized something in terms of that taking full responsibility for your behavior?
I saw a psychologist and sitting down with the therapist, having real intense conversations about my actions and understanding that the work that I needed to put in had to truly come from my acceptance of what I did. And again, hold myself solely responsible and accountable. And making the change was a journey because it required a lot of conversation. It required a lot of self-reflection, and it required me to accept that I was causing harm and I was a danger and I was losing my family as a result of it, and familiar connections and friends and job opportunities. Knowing all of those factors made it very important, but making sure that I stayed actively engaged in the services necessary made my transition highly effective.
Okay, thank you for that. Would you say that confrontation, because some people think about accountability as confrontation, is that the way to go, or were there elements of where support or change was important for you too?
Recognizing my own triggers, learning how to have conversations, and staying within myself. That was very, very important, because once I started to hone in on the signs that my body was giving me, that gave me a better awareness of how I was feeling. You saw the emotion when I was presenting, but you didn't see me shaking. I'm nervous and every part inside of my body is shaking. And understanding those triggers in certain situations helped me identify what the potential of my response and how I needed to engage or disengage and or figure out how I needed to de-escalate.
Thank you for that. Would you willing to tell us more about the process of healing with your children? What was that like? What did it require from you?
I had to really step back and accept that my children are an extension of me. And what I feed them, what I teach them, what I show them, they're going to take that reflection into the world. And making sure that I had conversations, healthy, healing conversations, not necessarily specifically geared towards everything that happened, but asking questions and listening to the responses and accepting a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old's response as being something that I needed to listen to and I had to learn from.
Thank you. And my last question, and then we can open it to the audience, is were you able to do some healing with your ex-partner? And it's okay if you don't want to answer that, but I find that interesting if there was a parallel process with your ex-partner.
To be truly transparent, my ex-wife cannot stand the earth that I live in or the ground that I walk on. And I don't blame her for it. And it's been more than 10 years, but I have to accept where she is, how she feels, and I have to clearly make sure that I understand how we need to move together. She is also an active part of my growth because it requires me to take time out to listen. I may not understand everything that she says, but when I ask questions and I try to gain a little bit more knowledge, she definitely tells me, and it definitely requires that I have a thick skin and I listen with intent on making her requests, depending on what they are, actionable items on my part so that she can see and feel safe and comfortable.
Thank you for that honest answer. Yes, thank you. We will talk a little more about it in my presentation from some research that I did with fathers who repair with their children. But one of the steps is accepting the consequences of your behavior, and what you are describing very graciously is, sometimes that means that some relationships will not be healed, and that's part of this. So, I mean, this is what makes this so real, right? It's complicated. It's complicated. So, if you don't mind, some questions from the audience. I can walk the mic actually. Does anybody have questions? Yeah, let's.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Chelsea. I am a social worker with DC Public Schools. I work at an elementary school. And so my question is about, I guess, hindsight is 2020. So as a kid, what resources do you think might have been helpful in preventing you becoming maybe abusive as an adult. And the reason I ask is because I feel like a lot of resources for domestic violence are reactive, and we don't have a lot of resources to prevent domestic violence from happening in the first place. And so I think about my students, they're in the kindergarten, first grade, second grade. We can start those conversations a lot earlier. So I was just wondering your thoughts about what might have helped prevent those things from happening.
I'll be 50 this year. And I say that because when I was growing up, the late 70s, early 80s, there wasn't a lot of services put forth when they saw children acting out or there were behavior issues. Only just almost 8 years ago, our DC public school system did away with zero tolerance and accepted restorative practice as a way of helping and to healing. And restorative practice has been in existence for more than 25 years to help recidivism in juveniles and youth. I probably predate that, but it would have been nice and helpful to have a school system that did not believe that zero tolerance was necessary. Also, I only gave you a brief snippet. My mom raised a man, and she raised the man the best way that she could and the best way that she knew how. So her toughness, her vigilance in making sure that she saw me into a path of being able to take care of myself, not just financially, but physically. And I'm not ashamed to say it, my mom fought with me. Not in the sense of she actually threw blows for me, but my mom had my back. She stood there with the stick and the bat, and she made sure that if I was going to fight, there wasn't going to be anybody else that was going to get involved. Do I blame her for any of that? No. I thank her for that. But I do know and understand that there needs to be a certain level of understanding from parents and engaging parents to help them know and understand the things that I had to learn over the past 15 years, that they are just as accountable. Those three major agents of socialization, school, work, and school, family, and your peers, like that's real. You as a teacher, Chelsea, you have our children for 8 hours out of the day. You are just as responsible for trying to help guide and navigate their choices, not just educationally, but to help them understand that intelligence. But I do believe that restorative practice and parents having much more awareness in what ACEs are, to not just to their children, but to themselves, and how effective that could have been and would have been for me as I was growing up.
Thank you. Looks like there's some questions online.
Um, we have a question for Mr. Jones from Ashley Rossler. Have you considered sharing your story on TikTok? The lessons you have to share could influence others to begin the journey you went on to heal and become more self-aware. And then her follow-up question, what specific roles did the people in your life play, like your siblings, your caregiver, mental health professionals, who helped you realize your behavior was destructive?
No, I'm never going to share my story on TikTok. And I mean, I'm gonna be honest with you. Right now, my job doesn't even know that I'm here. I took leave, and a lot of what I do outside of my work is personal, and I like to keep it personal. So granted, I see all of you here today, but I probably won't see any of you ever again. And I'm comfortable enough to know that I've shared my story well enough that you can be the catalyst to help other people understand that there is change that can be made. So no, I'm not going on TikTok, and yes, I will share my story publicly, but it's not for grandstanding. My children, how did they help make my change?
Mental health professionals.
So I had to accept the place of where I am and the caregivers and the professionals and where they are. And I knew that their microscopic look into me and what I said and what I did, I couldn't take personal. And that was part of the hardest thing that I've ever had to deal with. Next to every time I went into family court, they wanted to revisit how my case came into care. So being able to listen with the intention on, like I said, making an actionable change and asking questions how, and gaining more knowledge and understanding about not just who I am and how I can affect the world, but recognizing the people and the spaces that I'm engaged with to make sure that if they're escalated, I de-escalate or I stand down. If they're uncomfortable, I try to ask questions about, is there anything that I can do to help? Never what's wrong. Those are questions that I've learned from restorative practice. You can get the exact same result, but the connotation when the person receives it is very different. So actually listening, doing a little bit more research for understanding, and I guess most importantly that I didn't mention is having people around me that I trust with my dearest and my darkest secrets, and who are going to always encourage me and direct me towards improving myself and being better.
Good morning. Thank you for sharing your story. I too am a alumni of Anacostia High School, so, and also grew up in Ward 8. Question for you, in your, and I would say in your discovery of your new inner self, and with your children and parenting your children from your trauma and knowing what your trauma is, how did that affect your relationship with your mother, like healing those child wounds in yourself so that you can be able to show up for your children? How did it affect your relationship with your mother?
My mother is going to be who she is. She came up in the old school. So to have my mom scold me and provide punitive punishment, and for me to even act like I was going to do something was probably one of the most shameful things that she could even imagine. And it even inflicted a little bit more shame on me. So I just love my mom for who she is and how she was, and accept a lot of those good moments. And we had a lot more good moments than bad. And when I do say bad, it was because I was a hard-headed little boy that didn't want to come in when the street lights came on, that wanted to ride his bike from Naylor Road Southeast all the way out to Clinton, back at a time when I didn't have a quarter for a for a payphone, and we didn't have cell phones. So if I'm out 8 hours during the day, she was worried and upset. My relationship with my mom is great. I love her for who she is. She still reminds me about who I was. Whether she'll ever get over it, I really don't know. But it's about how I move forward and how I make the change and how I make the adjustment in reacting and responding and building my relationship with her. And also the same with my children, because they can be very resistant, but they are resilient. And my almost 19-year-old daughter, for all you parents out here, they never believed that I was a teenager. So I had to let her learn some things on her own, but I stayed in her ear. So where she is right now with some of the conversation that she's had with me lets me know that she listened and she took heed to what I was trying to teach her as I was growing in the exact same time.
Thank you. Maybe we can take a couple more questions now, and then we'll take more questions later.
Good morning. My name is Alma Joyner. I'm a case manager with House Haru. I want to thank you for your vulnerability and sharing your story. It's not easy being a man, regardless of what color you are. Sharing your story is vulnerable and as truthful as yours. So thank you. My question to you is, what would you like to see the services look like geared toward men? Because as you can see around the room, most of us are service providers, and most of the services we provide are geared specifically toward women and children experiencing domestic violence. So what would you like to see the services look like for men specifically?
So first thing I'm gonna say is a few years back, we did a fatherhood initiative group thing, and believe his name was Corey Best. He helped bring some fathers together. And even during my time, I saw that as a man with no children, there are just as many services out there as there are for women. But the ego of who a lot of men are sometimes resistant to those services. A man with children, a man with children in his care, he faces some different challenges, because as my children's mom went to shelter for abused and abused family and children, men, they have, just like Virginia Williams, but we're looked at from a different stigma when we not standing on our own 2 feet to try to make things happen. And you need to take into account that, and this is a part of my real response, because I'm a kind of cut it short. But the real systemic problem is not looking to grow past what you see in front of your face, and the entitlement that you felt early on in your years when you didn't take life seriously haunts you later on in your life as a man. And you're challenged with trying to provide for kids, get a home, maintain a certain level of stability, and society's view on men is that you need to get up, get out, and get something. I'm stealing from Outkast, but I mean that's real. So overall, I mean the services are there. Men just have to, like humble themselves and accept them, and then take a few extra steps and be even more patient with trying to get to where they needed to go. It took me 7 years to get my degree, but I had a goal. And I knew that it was something that I wanted. And I took odd jobs, and I went to class part-time, and I finished. And, I'm sitting here talking to you with a whole lot of other people that value my lived experience. So the patience, the perseverance, the work, the services are there. I guess the only last thing I am going to add from our fatherhood reboot, motivational interviewing has been a very effective tool within our agency that I value deeply. And you have to ask questions, and you have to be willing to listen to the answers and accept them, hear the story, and not be judgmental. And if there's something that you don't know or you don't understand, don't be afraid. Don't be frightened. Ask a follow-up question, because that means a lot when we can be heard and we get the feeling that you're listening. So, yes.
Maybe one more question. Hi, thank you so much again for being here and sharing your experiences and letting us pick your brain. My name is Liza Gergley, and I'm an advocate with My Sister's Place. I'm so glad that you mentioned restorative practices. I'm currently working on a certificate in restorative justice facilitation, and as a way to incorporate that into the lives of the families that I work with. And one of the barriers that I keep coming up against is getting the buy-in from the person who caused harm in the situation to get from defensive to the very crucial part in restorative practices of taking accountability. How do you see in your experience, how did you get from that, like being defensive, to that place where you were able to take accountability for your actions?
I learned that there's always two sides to a story. And even as a person who has committed intimate partner violence, you need people to listen. And when I had my domestic violence assessment, lacking accountability was a lot of what I saw throughout the report. And even today, I'm a paper person. I have it, I read it, and it comes off as being judgmental. But on the flip side, it's the power of asking questions. You working in restorative practice, you know that there are restorative questions that you can ask. Like, how did you come to this conclusion? How did you decide to make this decision? What are your feelings when you were going through this process? Those questions that are non-accusatory help give that person another level of vulnerability, because they're not being poked and prodded at. So that helps to bring about some of the buy-in and the change when they don't know that you're asking those sensitive questions to get them vulnerable, because you've asked those questions in a very different way, as opposed to what they're used to hearing people ask. What's wrong? What's going on? What happened? That gives people an opportunity to just start spewing different things at you, where it's like, it's my word against yours. And then I'm looking at the person who's in the middle, whose side are you going to side with? So learning how to ask those questions, make them non-accusatory, but I mean, in essence, you're tricking the person into being vulnerable and trying to give them a space for a level of understanding. Thank you.
Juan Carlos.
Yes. Oh, can you still do it? I have a couple of, thank you, Wendy. This is my colleague, Wendy, who will be presenting later. Just, maybe I'll ask you a couple. So there'll be more opportunities, hopefully, to talk to the Sean. But I think the question that was asked at the end was so relevant because you're asking the 64 billion question. Anyone who works in domestic violence, intimate partners violence, family violence would like to know, how do you break that denial? That's like the most crucial moment in some way in the process. That's why I was asking the Sean about that. And the truth is that there's no one way to do it. If there were one way to do it, and we knew that, then we wouldn't have the problem, right? We would be all doing it. So I think it's very important to consider that there are what we call futures pathways to accountability. And for some people might be self-interest. For some people is their partner saying, this is it, I'm leaving. For some people it's getting arrested, going to a batter's intervention program. I mean, there's many ways. One of the things that I like about your story, Deshaun, is that you didn't go to a battering intervention program. As far as I know, maybe you did, but you don't talk about it. But it was through other ways of accountability. And right now, as a movement, we're exploring those ways: restorative practices, transformative practices, community accountability, as well as motivational interviewing and so on. So what I want to talk to you about, which I think is relevant, is one of the pathways, one possibility on how to engage people who cause harm. And this is using fatherhood as a way in. And what is so interesting to me to talk to the Sean is, I mean, you say it very clearly, it was many things, but a primary thing was basically you wanted to be with your children, and that is true for many, many people who use violence. Their children, realizing the damage that is happening to the children, that can be the moment in which they start changing. So if we could have the PowerPoint now, finally. Thank you for all the technical support here. Let's see. Should I be pointing this somewhere? Over there? Doesn't seem to be working. Oh, it's working. Okay. So I also want to talk about the importance of centering our work with survivors. I mean, I know this is what you do, but sometimes I have to say that people get so inspired about working with folks who use violence that we sometimes forget about survivors and their needs. So just a quick reminder. So sorry about this. PowerPoint was made for an online presentation that we actually did together a few months ago, but either in the chat, if you are online, or in person, could a couple of people tell me, why do you think it is essential to center survivors when working with fathers who use violence? If we're going to do that work, why do we need to center survivors? Anyone in the room? And Wendy will bring the mic. Yes.
Oh, I'm coming.
Can you wait? Because the people online cannot hear you.
I was just going to say, I think it helps with the accountability piece. If you don't center the survivors, it can, I don't know, it erases why they're having to do the work in the first place. So.
Yeah, I love that. There's one over there. I recently was interviewing someone about this concept of accountability for folks who who go to battery intervention programs and are not mandated by the court. And I told this person, some people feel that how can you operationalize accountability? And she was saying, the illusion that someone that goes to court will be held accountable, that's not really the case. So through community, through partners, yeah, I think accountability can be more operationalized. Thank you. Back there.
When being client-centered in general, dad is a part of the process.
Can you say that again?
Dad is a part of the process.
That is
He's
the part of the
for the
process.
course. He's a part of whatever happened, good, bad, ugly, or indifferent. You can't remove him from the equation because he's a part of the equation.
Right. Right. Thank you. Maybe one more. Is there anything online? Yes. Sorry, Wendy, we're making you work here.
Okay, thank you, Wendy. So in the chat, the comment is, as Deshawn said, survivors may be more likely to experience or perpetrate violence in the future. So it's important to include them in the healing process. And of course, another comment is because broken families can, I think it's important because broken families can, basically the cycle will continue if you don't.
Okay, thank you. Was there one more hand? Let's take one more here.
I would also talk about like when we're evaluating harm to restore and like restorative processes, it is about healing the survivor. It needs to be at the forefront. And I think when you look at gender-based violence systemically, if you're focusing on those who commit the violence, you can be kind of repeating structural oppression by ignoring and marginalizing those that are actually the ones being victimized. So while preventing and doing this work and breaking the cycle is important, it shouldn't be at the cost of survivor services.
Absolutely. That's beautiful, because anyone who does restorative practices or transformative practice or community accountabilities, survivors are always or should always be at the center of that process. Otherwise, of course, we can cause more harm. So you answer some of these things. It's important to keep us grounded on the lived experiences, not only of people who cause harm, but also survivors and children who have been exposed to violence, to support ongoing safety and well-being, right, for both adult and child survivors. And this is an interesting one, to counteract potential for collusion and learn how to work with person who uses violence. It's very important to remember that people who use violence, especially when they are in the kind of pre-contemplation or resistive kind of period, can be very manipulative, right? And it's very easy to fall into the story of, oh yeah, they're changing, and then colluding with them, and then placing survivors, both adult and child survivors, at risk. Some of the benefits, you know this, building trust and sharing realistic information. It says here about abusive partner intervention programs, but about any kind of process, about restorative process, right? You cannot do a restorative process without building trust, getting full consent from the survivor, and then giving them realistic expectations of what can happen, providing safety planning and meaningful referrals, learning about their changing circumstances, and also learning about the person who uses violence. Many workers, I work a lot with child welfare, and right now I'm working with child support workers, and they often are concerned about their own safety for a good reason, right? Although I always tell them that a person who uses violence is much more likely to hurt their family than to hurt a social worker. But it happens. And I always tell them, if this is a big concern of you, talk to the survivor about it. She, and I will use the gender language here right now, but it could be a he, will tell you, is this a person that gets in fights with everybody, that has assaulted police officers? Then I would be really careful. If this is something that only gives the violence to the family, then there's is less likely that you will be in danger. And of course, centralize on safety and well-being for adult and child survivors. You work, many of you, with survivors, so I don't have to spend a lot of time with those issues, but if you don't work in an IPV survivors agency, it's important to have those partnerships, right? Get cross-training and so on. The survivors should their contact should always be voluntary, whether it's in a restorative process or in a battery intervention program. Be informed, be transparent, ask about the concerns and fears, and answer questions about potential limitations of what can happen. And in terms of some pitfalls to end this person, it's like the first one is do no harm, right? That should be, there's many medical doctors here. That should be a maxim that we also adopt as a movement, and always prioritizing safety for survivors. We know that having contact with survivors can increase risk, and of course, all contact should be confidential. So now let's switch a little bit talk a little bit about children, since this is a focus of this conference in some way, in terms of understanding their needs. Deshaun, you already made a great case here and talking about that exposure of children to violence is an epidemic in this country as well as other countries. It's an epidemic. We're talking millions and millions. This is a little revised from the 15 million one. It's a more recent one, but we're talking about millions and millions of kids that are involved. And this one is about physical IPV, okay? Almost 18 million children a year exposed to, almost 14 million children, 18% of children. And there's a lot of research also suggesting that there is an overlap between child abuse and domestic violence, which makes a lot of sense. Again, you mentioned this before, Deshaun, children experience domestic violence differently. You know this, right? Depending on their age, the frequency, proximity, and so on. And again, Deshaun, gave some good examples, both personal and in general, of how children are affected. You all know this, so I will not spend a lot of time of this, but the effects are pervasive. However, I strongly believe that every time that we talk about the impact of violence on children, we also have to talk about resilience, and you did that too. Resilience and protective factors. And that was one of the questions to Deshaun, right? What would have made a difference for you? And that's what we're talking about, protective factors. What can we all do as a society to either mitigate or to prevent this violence? And of course, more and more research is coming out of this. This is just a set of protective factors that we use in a project called the Quality Improvement Center on Domestic Violence and Child Welfare that Wendy was also part of. These are research-based. There's other sets of protective factors, but these are good examples. And probably you have heard this one. I think the CDC has named the #1 protective factor for children exposed to violence is a relations with a loving, stable, consistent adult in their lives. Some people call that everyday magic because it's at that level. And you know what? That's something that we all can do with the children of our lives. And furthermore, since we were listening to Deshaun's story, what about children witnessing someone who was abusive and then changed and then has become another caring and loving adult in the lives of children? We cannot underestimate. That hasn't really been studied a lot because we haven't studied a lot the healing process of people who use violence. We have studied it very little, actually. But you can imagine how powerful the example that Deshaun and other men and women and people of all genders like him have given to their children. And then, of course, safe conditions, safer because absolute safety cannot be guaranteed, and stable conditions, social, cultural, and spiritual connections. We know this, right? Community makes a difference, resilience and a growth mindset, nurturing parent-child interactions, and social and emotional abilities that was also mentioned before. Again, let's always remember that sometimes I have heard folks talking about the impact of violence like it's a sentence for children, right? If this happens, children are condemned to repeat these patterns, and that is actually not true. Actually, a big piece of information that doesn't get shared enough is that the majority of boys who grow up in abusive households do not become abusive. Okay. Sometimes we do a false equivalency because we know, as Deshaun mentioned, the majority of men who grow up in households did witness violence, but that doesn't mean that the majority of men who grew up in boys who grew up in households will become abusive. And for me, this is one of the big good news. And the following question would be like, why? What makes that difference, right? And it is where the protective factors come into play. Now, it's also important to recognize, again, as Deshaun's story tell, is that sometimes there can be reparation and healing between parents who use violence and their children. And I'll share a little later a piece of research I did about 20 years ago in which I got to interview a bunch of fathers about this process. But right now, I'd like to ask you, if you ask children what they need and want from their abusive fathers to heal, what do you think they would say? Again, anyone in the room or online. If you ask a child, okay, what do you need from your father to heal? Yes.
I'm sorry. I think the first thing a child would say is admittance, like to be honest.
Admittance, acknowledgement.
Right. But also, and then the space to say how they want to rebuild, like their boundaries, the space to have their boundaries, or the space to be able to talk out their feelings safely.
Yeah.
Because then once you have that balance inflicted on you, then you don't feel safe to be honest.
Okay.
So there's safety to be honest, and also the safety to be able to reestablish how they want the relationship to be on their terms.
Okay.
Because then that helps to give them the courage to get their voice back.
Right, on their terms. Excellent. I see a couple of hands. What's their hand over here? Oh, for the online, you have a mic, right? So what about Deshaun here? And then we'll go to online.
After I was reunified, I asked my oldest daughter, what is it that I could do to help her? And she didn't say it real eloquently. She was only 9, but she was like, can you stop getting angry? Can you stop yelling?
Mm.
And just those two things let me know that what she saw was my reaction. And that was a way that I could actually help her make an adjustment by not getting angry, not showing that I was visibly angry, and not raising my voice, because that's a whole nother level of letting them see that I was mad or angry.
Beautiful. So you have to stop that behavior in order to heal. You know, we make an equivalence with a physical wound. Obviously, you don't heal if you keep on, touching it and infecting it and so on. Anyone else would like to share what would be needed? There's a hand over here. Is there anything online? Alison? Yeah. Okay.
I've worked with children, and some of the things that they basically said was stop being that monster, because a lot of times kids saw that individual as a monster.
Wow.
They saw them transform from the father or the mother that they knew into like a Hulk Hogan. I mean, not Hulk Hogan, but the Incredible Hulk.
Yeah.
So it was like a monster to them.
Wow. The Hulk. That's a good analogy. Thank you. Online?
Yeah, so online, we have listening and respect for the child to be heard and loved and know that they are loved. And they want to see them feel empathy.
feel empathy. Okay, beautiful. Okay, thank you, Wendy. If we can have the PowerPoint back, please. So you're right on target with so many of these things. So what I like to share here is actually a study that recent from 2018 that was done in Australia. Is the first study that I know of where they actually ask a sample of children who had been exposed to domestic violence what they needed from their father. So exactly that. And this was in particular about fathers, no mothers. And you can see that the researchers put it in 3 different buckets. The first one is addressing the past, as someone mentioned, acknowledging the past. You cannot just say, okay, let's move on. The past doesn't exist, right? That includes apologizing, which is, I think it's a topic that in our field is controversial because many people who use violence falsely apologize and even use it to manipulate. However, all the children in the study, every single children, said that they would like a genuine and complete apology from their fathers and accept the consequences. Going back, that's why I asked you that question, Deshaun. The consequences sometimes means no more contact with your ex-partner. Sometimes means no contact with your children or for a period of time. Those are natural consequences, right? Admitting the wrongdoing and acknowledging the harm that they have caused. Again, this all come from children, right? Number 2 bucket, a commitment to change. So it's not enough to say, I'm sorry, I did this, but like, what are you going to do now, from now on? And then changing behavior and attitude. So back to what your daughter said is like, stop yelling, right? That scares me, you know? I mean, I'm putting words on her mouth, but probably that's what was happening, you know? So not only behavior, but also attitudes, because we know that a lot of this comes from certain attitudes that we have. And it's pretty amazing that the children verbalize that, you know? And this is an interesting one. The young people in the interview wanted to be part of the changing process. So going back to restorative practices, what would look like between a restorative practice or transformative practice between a child that has been prepared and support and their fathers or mothers? Very powerful. And then rebuilding the trust. That's something that doesn't happen automatically, right? Investing time and effort on the children, considering their perspective and stepping up to parenting and co-parenting. And actually, this last one was interesting. The children were very clear that this didn't mean like, you take me to McDonald's on the weekend, right? Or if you have money, take me to Disneyland. No, you do the hard work of parenting and co-parenting, showing up, going to parent teacher conferences, going to games, being there, really showing up fully. So that makes a lot of sense. I'll come back to this a little later. Trying to change the slide here. Okay, so finally, we've been talking about this. So I like to share now a video with you. It's about a 10-minute video that we produce as part of the Quality Improvement Center on Domestic Violence and Child Welfare. It's a video that shows a social worker working with a father. And I like to say a couple of things. The father in this case is African-American. We have other videos that represent other ethnicities. I don't want to, you know, always a disclaimer that obviously it's not people of all ethnicities are abusive. You see at the beginning, actually, there's a little short segment on a Caucasian man also talking about it. And the other thing is that the family members in this video are actors. The workers are real workers. So that's how we set it up. So let's play it, please.
Me and my wife were arguing and we ended fighting. The police were involved because I pushed my son down in the midst of it all, and I was arrested.
We showed up at Keith's basketball game. I saw her talking to another guy, and we ended up getting in a fight, and then we went to the parking lot, and things got a little physical. So,
working with people who have used violence with their partners or with their children is really difficult. This work is hard. You hear challenging things every day.
The first step that I take when working with a person who uses violence is to do some planning with the survivor to make sure that I'm not going to make things worse for the family. Many times the people that I'm working with have had trauma in their own lives, and healthy aspects of a relationship like trust, patience, honesty, good communication, these things might not come naturally to them.
Some of the best memories I have are me and my dad going fishing. He loved to fish, and sometimes he can be really mean.
I think one of the ways I've learned to help is learning from the community that we're trying to serve. Safety can mean different things for different people. We need to understand that clients must teach us how to serve them. And historically, we haven't done that.
The better job I do in engaging with the person using violence, the more I help the adult survivor and the children.
Faith organizations, family, community support can all be a part of a coordinated response that looks a little different from what we've experienced traditionally. In some communities, particularly in communities of color, institutions within the criminal justice system may not always be seen as an institution that is a friend to that community.
I think it's important as a white worker to acknowledge racial differences and to acknowledge my position of privilege, and that I can't fully understand their experience, but I can empathize and I can help.
If you have created a space for them where they will not feel judged, and you inquiry as to how they are and what they're going through, people will be more comfortable in speaking with you and then beginning to apply it to their actions.
I think I can tell that a person is opening up more when they're a little bit more willing to start talking about some of their own experiences. I think that's often a really good sign that I can kind of keep delving into that and push the work a little further.
It was a wake-up call for me, and I learned to talk with love in my heart rather than rage and anger, which allowed my kids to see a different perspective.
being together as a family means everything, and I'll continue to do the work I need to do so we can stay together.
I hold on to hope when I meet with the family and they say, what normally caused the fight this time didn't happen.
It's important to imagine that change is possible.
My hope for my kids is to show them that it's okay to be you and to show the world a more positive way of, being a human being.
Often getting a person who uses violence to take action that benefits themselves and their families is one of the hardest parts of my job. One of the most powerful tools I have is to use fatherhood to help them change their perspective and get the help they need. Thanks for agreeing to meet with me. Tell me a little bit about your understanding of why your family got involved with child protection.
My wife told me that the kids may be going into foster care, and I don't want that to happen, so I'm here.
Sounds like keeping your family together is really important to you.
Yeah, but she's not a good mother anyway, and she has no control over the kids.
So oftentimes when I'm talking to people who use violence, they'll bring up their partners. And usually this conversation doesn't really lead anywhere. So I try to redirect the conversation and pivot a little bit back to focusing on the family as a whole and specifically on the child's perspective.
A lot of people place blame on someone else or don't take responsibility for their own actions. Having someone understand that part or begin to is very important on getting them to go on the right path.
Can you tell me a little bit more about your understanding of why your family got involved with child protection?
I was arrested last week. Me and my wife were fighting. I accidentally pushed my son down. The police shows up and they tell me that I have to leave my house. And me being a man, I felt that was wrong. Telling me to leave my home where I pay all the bills.
It must have been a shock to have to leave your home like that.
Mm-hmm.
Where were your kids when this was going on? What was happening for them?
When I bring up the child's perspective, it often helps the domestic violence offender to see it in their child's view and see the impact that they've had on their child.
It allows for them to see how their actions affect someone that they love.
When my son tried to jump in and my kids, well, my daughters, I should say, they were in the room and they were asleep, so they didn't hear nothing.
Why'd your son try to jump in?
I don't know. I mean, maybe because my wife plays the victim all the time, and he feels that he's protecting her from whatever it is, and she's convinced him that I'm just this monster or something.
So I can imagine what your son thinks of you is probably really important.
Yeah.
I wonder if maybe he was trying to jump in because he's seen his mother get hurt in the past.
My wife got physical, but nothing to that extent. I mean, she gives as good as she gets anyway.
I think showing interest in the perspective of the person using violence can really help build empathy and trust in the relationship. I know this isn't easy.
I guess, whatever.
So we were talking about your son wanting to jump in.
I don't beat my wife. And I feel like that's what you're implying right now. Is that what she's telling you? Okay, if so, I need to know.
Well, you know, we did talk to your wife.
Okay.
We talked to your kids too. And your family loves you a lot.
I love them too, but I need to know what she said.
They said that you like to go fishing together as a family. What do you like about it?
It's quiet. I mean, it's peaceful at times. Me and my dad used to go a lot when we were younger, and it was always fun. I mean, at times he could be mean, but overall it was a fun time.
So a lot of times people will start to bring up experiences they've had with their own fathers, and this can be a great opportunity to kind of help them think about parenthood and what kind of parent they would like to be. You know, I think a person can be a good man and still have times when things get out of control and people get hurt. What do you think about that?
What do I think? I see what you're doing here, and you're not slick. I'm a great provider for my family. And yeah, sometimes I have a temper, but that doesn't mean I don't love my kids. I love my dad, I love my kids, they love me. So can you stop, please?
Do you remember how you felt as a kid when your dad would get angry?
I was mad. But, I mean, other times, maybe I felt a little sad.
Imagine that was really hard for you.
I guess.
I'm sorry that happened to you.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anybody that you could talk to about that?
Nope. It's in the past, so leave it alone.
Sometimes these experiences could have impacts on us as adults. If you were going to talk to somebody about it, who would you talk to?
I really don't want to talk to anyone.
I wonder if it's possible that maybe your son feels the same way sometimes.
I guess you could say that. The last thing I want is my own kids to be scared of their dad.
So once I've gotten the person talking a little bit about their experience as a child and what kind of parent they would like to be, then I'll open the conversation up to what being a good father looks like to them.
I think it's important for fathers to be able to define that, what it is to be a good father, and actively work towards achieving that.
What kind of dad do you want to be? What does being a good father look like to you?
Making sure my kids are okay and creating memories with them. Teaching my son to not only be a man, but be a responsible man at that.
What about your daughters?
What about my daughters?
What do you want them to learn about relationships, like with future partners or husbands?
For my daughters, a whole other story. I mean, both of them are mouthy. But, you know, I refuse to let any man put their hands on her. That's my babies.
It sounds like you want them to be who they are.
No, I just want to be respected.
You know, a lot of men who love their families end up doing some damage sometimes when they get angry. There's actually a group here in town for men who've been involved with courts found that connecting it back to fatherhood can prove as a very powerful motivator in making change and taking those next steps to become that father that they would like to be.
You just kind of, I know you're not talking about therapy.
No, it's not a therapy group.
It sounds like you're talking about therapy.
It's not a therapy group. It's just a group for men to get together and talk about these
For
kinds
what?
of things. A lot of the men say it's really helped them a lot.
Okay, that's fine, but that's not me.
Just based on everything you've said, it sounds like you really care about your family.
Yeah, I care about my family, but I'm not going to a therapy.
And you really want to do right by your kids.
Yeah.
And I think it would send a really positive message to them if you were to try this group out and see if maybe it can help you.
You think it will?
I think trying this group out will give you a better chance of your family staying together. And it sounds like that's something that's really important for you.
I mean, if I have to go, I'll go.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a call in a couple days and we can talk more about it. Okay? When doing this work, I think it's important to have both a healthy skepticism and also kind of an unwavering optimism, and not being too trusting or too soft, but also hold this idea that change is always possible and being able to see the strengths in people.
Okay, so I know that it's very difficult to show
Me and my wife.
all these strategies in 10 minutes, right? And that what you saw that the person probably it's unrealistic that that will happen in 10 minutes. That would happen over a few different sessions if it happens at all. But I think it gives a good idea of what this balance of what accountability or consequences and support for change can be. I would like to share some other or emphasize some other strategies on working with fatherhood, if I can have the PowerPoint back. And by the way, a round of applause for the technical people here. They are amazing in real time, solving echoes and subtitles and everything else. So we don't have a lot of time, and I think this video shows a lot of these things. If I were doing a longer training, we would have a debrief about the video because it's not perfect. You know, there are things there that could be improved. It was improvised by and large. So, but I think it's a good point of departure. So I would like to share some other tools just as an example of some of the things that I and other practitioners have used. So going back to the question of how do you break through the denial, which is so challenging. One way, it's not universal, but one way is to raise awareness about the effects of violence on children. Many fathers, many mothers, many parents don't realize what we know from the research and from the practice of the pervasive effects of violence on children. And sometimes realizing that can make an enormous difference. So what I'm going to share with you is an exercise that I developed many years ago as part of a project called Fathering After Violence, in which in a battery intervention group, we showed some children's drawings, and then we processed together what they saw. Just to tell you, the children's drawings are real drawings. They happen to be children from Mexico City. And just a very quick side story is that my colleagues, I grew up in Mexico actually, so colleagues, that what they did is that they went to schools, like elementary and middle schools, and they asked children to make drawings about how they see their father. That was the only prompt. How do you see your father? And The children could draw, could write, and whatever. And they ended up with a huge sample of drawings. I'm only using 5 here because I saw them. They would go then to different places and do fatherhood workshops and show these drawings. And I saw how powerful they could be. They kind of bypass your brain and go directly to your gut. So this first one is from an 8-year-old child. Remember, the question is, how do you see your father? And he writes,
you have to room in here.
father, because he gets very grumpy and his eyes turn, he gets drunk and his eyes turn red. So going back to the person who said, so the child is a monster. I mean, here's like a devil with horns and cape and a trident, right? And what I like about these drawings, I'm sure you have seen or maybe had used other sets of children's drawings. Some of them tend to be very graphic in terms of the violence, like there's blood and there's knives. And what I've seen with folks who use violence is that they don't associate themselves with that level of violence. That's not me, right? That's there's categories, right, of people who use violence. But this drawing, I've seen literally in a workshop. I saw a man look at this drawing for the first time and said, "Oh my God, that's me, and I need help." And that was the beginning of his story. One thing that I like about these drawings is that they are not all negative. So this is a 11-year girl. How do I see my father? Like a superhero. And sadly, for some of the men, this has even more impact for some of them because they cannot conceive that their children would see their father as a superhero. It's just not a possibility for them, right? This one is incredibly powerful and amazing artist, 13-year-old boy, no words, right? And there might be a question of who the person is in the front, but we know who the person in the back is. And that's the father shadow. And the next one, we know all the, what we call sometimes the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde effect. So he made 2 drawings and wrote on the right, on the outside, on the left, on the inside, right? So outside, like he has his tie, he's at work, he's smiling, and inside he's some kind of anime demon or something like that. And he writes, "I shouldn't judge him because he gave me his life, but he's irresponsible." And then I always like to finish with my favorite, which is very unambiguous. "If from the mountain of life I slip, my father gives me his hand and gives me strength to keep on climbing." Isn't that beautiful? So after I borrowed this from my colleagues in Mexico, I developed an exercise in which I ask men in battery intervention groups and fatherhood programs, after seeing then this and briefing, talking about it, to do their own drawings of how they think their children see them, right? Put themselves in the shoes of the children. And at the beginning, everybody wanted to be Superman, so I had to ask for a negative and a positive one. But it's a very, very powerful exercise of empathy, if you will. It's important, I think, in the video and in Sean's story, hope. Hope is not an abstract thing. There's something called the science of hope. There's research behind how to create hope. You mentioned motivational interviewing. That's part of it, but there's other ways to create hope. This is from our colleagues from the Center of Core and Innovation. Basically, the science says you need a way to do it. You have goals and the willpower to do it, and that's what gets you there. This slide is very parallel to the one that I showed before about what the children want from their fathers, but this was a framework that I developed 20 years ago when I interviewed fathers who have been abusive and had repaired with the children and asked them the same question: what was needed there? And you will see that the parallels are amazing, right? It's almost the same framework, so which makes a lot of sense. And some of the things that you said, And that the Sean said, like listening, validating, not forcing the process, and so on. So I'm putting this as some practitioners use it almost as a way to measure real change and healing between fathers and their children. I do want to mention culture, because sometimes when we're working cross-culturally, however you define culture, I'm not only talking about race, right? Gender, abilities, and so on, gender gender identity and sexual orientation. When we work cross-culturally, we often see culture as an obstacle, but culture is also an asset, okay? And if someone, especially if they are from a disadvantaged or oppressed group, if they perceive that whatever we're telling them is something that is coming from the dominant culture, whatever that is, we will not be very successful at creating change. It's important to remember that every culture has values that support violence and that resist violence. And we need to figure out what are those values for the person that we are working with. And finally, utilizing legacy can be a powerful tool. What I'm showing here is a workbook that we developed recently, directed to fathers who have used violence and want to change. You can download it directly from our website for free, and you can print it. It's a series of 12 exercises that cover a lot of the strategies that we talked about. It's designed, you can use it on your own, but a lot of people are using it like in therapy and in different kinds of groups. I think we got like 2,000 downloads the first 6 months or so, so people are finding it useful. And I'll just end with this, with the title, how do you want your kids to remember you? That is a powerful question, powerful question. We have an exercise that you probably have seen before. Sometimes people do like have people write their own obituary, like how do you want, like if your child was going to write your obituary, what would they say right now about you? And what would you like to change? I changed it in this to an 80th birthday party and someone giving a toast, because some of the reviewers thought it was a little, I don't know. Yeah, they didn't want to deal with that. So I realized that we ran out of time. I'm glad that we were able to do questions in the middle, especially for the Sean, but I just want to end with these learning points. For some men who use IPV, fatherhood can be a powerful motivator of change. There are multiple strategies that can be used with fathers, so we share some in the video and in the talk, and of course in the Sean story, depending on the circumstances. There's not one size fits all. And balancing what we call accountability traditionally, which is really consequences, with support for change is an effective way to work with people who use violence. Thank you very much. And thank you again to the Sean for a great presentation.